on the financial information. Just want to make sure, Tommy, can y'all hear me in the back?
Get close to your mic.
Tracy, can you hear me back there? Thank you. I just want to make sure. We're going to go ahead and start with the finance presentation, and there are 3 areas that we're required to educate the board on. Those are budget development, fiscal management, and fiscal accountability. I wanted to just start out and have just a few simple definitions to go over, and there are just 3 up here, but I just want to make sure that when we talk about budget, that everybody understands what that means to us. And really what our budget is just a financial projection of what we think our revenues are going to be for a specified time period and the plan we have to utilize those funds and how we're going to use them. So again, a budget is just an operating financial plan. Okay? Fiscal year. Fiscal year is just the period we talk about for our fiscal operations. And the fiscal year, being a governmental entity for Smoky, runs July 1st through June 30. So when we talk about our budget and developing the budget for the fiscal year, that budget is for operations July 1st through June 30. Okay? And then last is IBNR. We talked a little bit about that yesterday, incurred but not reported. Again, those are services that we estimate have been provided but not yet billed to Smoky. That dollar amount can be significant, so we estimate that at each month end so we don't underestimate our expenses. What it talks about is services not yet billed to the payer, and I just want to make sure that everybody has the understanding that Smoky is the payer of the Medicaid services for behavioral health and intellectual and developmental disabilities, and those services are billed to Smoky as the payer, not billed to Medicaid. And I'm not sure that's really been clearly explained yet, so I want to make sure everybody understands that. Does that make sense? Okay. What am I doing that? Budget development is the first area. The budget has to be adopted by the governing board. Again, we're governmental, so by statute, the governing board adopts our annual budget. It's adopted again for the fiscal year, which starts July 1st, goes through June 30. We have to have a balanced budget. Our budgeted revenues have to equal our budgeted expenditures. That does not mean at year end that we may not have a surplus or even a deficit, but it does mean that we have to project our revenues and expenditures in an equal amount. Part of the reason for that is you cannot project and utilize expenditures for which you don't have a planned revenue source. So that's the reason for having a balanced budget. Anything that's budgeted in the current fiscal year, the appropriations for that purpose lapse at year end. So each year, the board approves a new budget for the next fiscal year. Our expenditures can't exceed the budget by what is called a functional level, and this is still in the statute. There are 6 functional levels. One of them is personal services, and what's contained in there are salaries, fringes, professional services, accounting, legal, that type of thing. We really have like hundreds of accounting lines that we track our expenditures by. They're all grouped into one of these 6 functional levels. When the board approves the expenditure budget, they approve at the functional level. So again, personal services is a functional level. Supplies and materials is another example of a functional level. So if the board approves in our annual budget, let's just say $300,000 for supplies and materials. Legally, we cannot overexpend $300,000 on supplies and materials. If we have a need to do that, we would bring back a budget amendment to the board and ask for the budget to be amended. There is one exception, functional level, if a budget request or a realignment is $5,000 or under, the CEO has the authority to make that approval. Smoky is typically just always brought back any amendment to the board for adoption. There are some timeframes in statute that guide your budget and the budget adoption. By April 30th, Smoky has worked with all of our departments, stakeholders, identified the use for our revenue sources. We also work with CFAC. CFAC develops their own budget and manages their budget. So we will work internally to identify all of our budget requests, and also we will project what our budgeted revenues will be. By June 1st, we have to present the budget to the board, so we bring that to the May board meeting, and we'll go over the budget in detail from the personnel budget down to all the expenditures, how we've calculated the revenues, what the revenue sources are, and then we will allow a comment period and then bring the budget back to the June board meeting for adoption. We also will publish the proposed budget on our website, so it's available to the public. We also have a copy of that at our administrative offices and make ourselves available to go over the budget with any member of the public or anybody that wants to review the budget with us or provide any type of feedback. The two largest areas of the budget are in administration, our personal services that I mentioned earlier, and then in purchase of service with providers, and all those are contracted services. And again, that's where we're contracting with a provider to provide service to individuals. When we develop the budget, the first thing we typically look at are our revenues. We're really not revenue generators, we're not a taxing authority, so our revenues are fairly predictable, and the majority of them come from the state, and those are specified typically to the use of those revenues. Medicaid, where we're paid the PNPM, and our county maintenance of effort funds. And I want to go back just a minute to the Medicaid per member per month. We estimate the number of Medicaid eligibles that we're going to have. We get a rate from the Division of Medical Assistance that says how much we get paid per member, and we use that to project out what our annual revenues are. I think it's about the second week in March, we're going back to Raleigh to meet with Mercer, and they're going to give us our Medicaid rate for next fiscal year. Right now, we have a rate for Western Highlands that continues to June 30, and we have a rate for Smoky's original 15 counties. So as of July 1st, we're going to have this blended rate. So one of the things we, of course, have tried to do is a lot of analysis to say what do we think our costs are going to be and what should that rate be. We've also already met with Mercer and DMA to provide information that we hope will influence the rate, I guess is a fair way to say it. Because we want to make sure that we think we have a fair rate and the rate's sufficient to cover the services that are needed in our communities. Once we've identified the revenues, there are a number of processes that we work internally to identify what our expenditures will be. The main one, of course, that we're concerned with is the service delivery. So we know what our continuation allocation from the Division of Mental Health will be, so we plan for that with our clinical and UN staff and other stakeholders that we engage, and we develop a plan to say how we are proposing to spend those service dollars in the communities. The next one, and also I want to point out on the state services aren't an entitlement, so we want to make sure we can manage those dollars to meet the needs over a 12-month period. If we spend those funds in the first 6 months, there are not additional funds coming to Smoky, so we got to ensure that we manage in a way that allows us to provide service for the 12-month period. Medicaid services, that is an entitlement, so We are at risk for those services. We get a fixed amount of funding, and that sometimes when you hear us refer to capitation or a capitated amount, we're paid again based on the number of Medicaid eligibles. That's a fixed amount. Depending on the number of eligibles, we're required to provide all medically necessary services to Medicaid consumers. That's why we've got to track, trend, and monitor that closely to ensure that we have enough resources to pay for those Medicaid services. This shows how our revenues are currently budgeted by function. And right now, our current budget is $305 million. Starting July 1st, our budget's going to be more like $330 or $340 million. And the reason there's going to be a big jump, and I want to go ahead and try to explain that now, so when we come back in a couple of months with the budget, we're not all going, well, gosh, where did we get $30 million? But this budget's the consolidated budget with Western Highlands, and since we didn't consolidate until October 1st, our current budget only contains 75% of what had been Western Highlands' budget. So there's a quarter of their budget not currently in here, and it's estimated to be around $30 million or so. So that will be the difference for the increase in our budget starting July 1st. Of our revenue, currently there's $259 million projected for service. That's 85% of our revenues currently. There's $34 million projected for administration, and that's 11%. And I also want to note, when we get an allocation from the state, they have specified how much is to be used for administration. Same thing with Medicaid, they've identified a percentage that's administration. So we are not taking administrative dollars from services. That's already delineated for us. And I think that's an important distinction because, again, all service dollars are used for provision of service. We also have about 2% of the budget in the risk reserve, and that's all related to Medicaid. And then we have about $6.8 million of miscellaneous revenue. Some of that's contracted income where we're paying for expenses that have been related to the transition. We have Shelter Plus Care grants and some other funding that's in the 6.8 million. This is also on the revenues, but it shows the source of the revenue and where it comes from. Currently, we get $243 million from Medicaid. Part of that service, part admin, and part risk reserve. $54.9 million from state. Our county funding is 1.8, and again, this is 75% of Western and 100% of the year for Smoky's other 15 counties. You can see our county funding for revenue is only 1% of our budget, and then we have $5 million in other. And again, it's some of the sources that I just identified. This is our budgeted expenditures by the functional level that I just mentioned, and these are the 6 functional levels. Contracts, which is purchase of service, $265 million, and then personal services is $30 million. So you can see those are the 2 large areas of the expenditures. Our capital outlay budget for the current year is $2.8 million, and typically in a normal year it is never anywhere near that amount due to the consolidation and the transition. We've upgraded like our phone system, additional computer equipment, additional bandwidth, et cetera, and that's the reason for what is a much higher than normal capital outlay budget. Before I go to the next section, are there any questions about the budget or anything that wasn't clear that needs further clarification? Okay. Yes.
I know this, but just as a refresher, can you remind me some of the bigger services that we provide through state dollars?
Are you talking about just dollar volume, Michael?
In other words,
Psychiatric, paying for the walk-in centers, mobile crisis, facility-based crisis, ACT, ESR. Those are probably the largest ones. We typically don't pay for PRTF, which is a level 4 residential through state dollars. A lot of outpatient services, which of course fall into the psychiatric and the walk-in.
By and large, it's that kind of core outpatient cluster of services that we don't transact on a fee-for-service basis. A lot of this is what we call subcapitated, so we're not counting all the widgets on this. It's part of it's really something I look forward to talking more about. The whole way we're developing the network around comprehensive care centers and how we use money. It's a combination of payer source and services to get the maximum benefit.
I'm going to go on to the fiscal management. This is just kind of a short definition of what fiscal management is. And it really is to be able to ensure that we manage our resources to accomplish the objectives of our agency. There's some just guiding principles that we want to operate under and that we do operate under for fiscal management. We want to be consistent in carrying out our policies, whether that's internal or with providers. We want to be accountable. We have a lot of, as Brian said earlier, a lot of reporting and a lot of oversight. We want to be transparent. We want to make whatever financial information you feel like you need to make decisions or be informed. We'd like to make that available to you. We want to be honest and operate with integrity, and we want to be good stewards of the public funds. Those are really the guiding principles that we operate under. Here's some of the different methods of fiscal management. Financial reporting, which I know we've talked about a lot, and I think Nancy said last night there's something like 137 reports we produce routinely, and somehow I feel like in finance we produce even more than that, but there are so many reports that are produced and analyzed, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or annually. And just some examples, of course, would be in the financial area, our balance sheet, income statements, our defensive interval, which is days of cash on hand, current ratio, and really we could go on. And one of the big areas we really haven't even talked about is claims, which is in finance. And there are so many claims reports on volume of claims monthly, the amount of claims that we pay. And when we're saying claims, we're talking about a claim from a provider to pay for the individual service. So we have, we process about 160,000 claims a month, and right now I think the approval rate's somewhere between 80 and 85% of claims that go through clean, I believe, on the first time. We have had quite a bit of increase in claims denials when we consolidated, because the Western Highlands providers were now billing a new computer system. It's like billing NC Tracks, and we all know what the denial rate there is. So anyway, it's a change for providers when you change computer systems, so the rate of denials has increased over the last couple of months. Comparative statements, of course we do prior year comparisons to the current year. We compare prior month to current month, prior quarters, etc. So there are a lot of comparative statements so we can understand what's happening with their financial position. We do budget analysis. When the board adopts the budget, each month we look to see what variances we have and what's been projected and what's actually occurred. We do a lot of dashboards and trending. We went over a couple last night about the current ratio, and these can give us early insight into changes in what's happening throughout our agency. Because one of the things that happens, we have a unit a clinical utilization management unit, and they are authorizing all the services that are going to be provided, and we have contracts for those services. So we run a lot of reports to see what's been the level of authorizations, what does that cost, and try to project it out so we can identify trends if all of a sudden a certain service category is going up. And the reason to do that is not to not have that service provided, but to ensure that we have enough funding to be able to meet that financial obligation. Financial controls, there are a number of financial controls in place, pre-auditing disbursements, having contracts in place to pay providers, having staff action sheets when we do new hires, not making payroll changes without appropriate sign-off on that, approval of purchase orders. So there are just a number of internal controls that we have to ensure that the money is used appropriately. Early warning signs. I think that's probably one of the things, in my opinion, that saved us, Brian, when we first went under waiver. We had identified a number of early warning signs that were either level of authorization or service expenditure by category, looking at our financial reports, and about the second or third month we were under the waiver, we started waving the red flag and said, man, if we keep on this trend, we're not going to be here too long. So we have like 10 or 12 early warning signs, and that helped us really start managing better, I think, especially around our authorization protocols. But there are a number of those to look at high-cost consumers. There are a number in finance, and there are a number in our clinical union department. Okay, the next section is on fiscal accountability. This just talks a little bit about we want to be accountable for the use of the funds. We want to make sure we have controls in place to not overspend and to ensure we are complying with all the federal and state laws and regulations that we need to comply with. An example again is the pre-audit. If we enter into a contract where we're obligating a fixed amount of funding, it has to be pre-audited by finance because we have to say we have that funding committed in the budget to meet that obligation. To not do that is a violation of the state statute. Staff are well educated and know they can't just go out and make a purchase and then come back and say, oh, will you pay for this? They know they have to have a pre-approved purchase order. And without that type of control, we would not be able to manage our budget. One, it's required by law, and two, we just would not be able to manage without having the controls in place. Also, regarding compliance and regulations, we just a couple of months ago finished our fiscal year 12-13 audit, and Smokey did not have any out of compliance or findings with our audit. So I think we really do a good job in complying. Sometimes we have a couple of blips, but for the most part, we're pretty good at it. Okay. Here's some of the ways that we ensure that we're fiscally accountable. Internal controls and segregation of duties, and those kind of go hand in hand, but you want to design a system where you ensure you have segregation of duties. And an example would be you would not want me to receive funds, make the deposits, do the journal entry for it, and reconcile the cash account. Because if I did all those, I could steal money. So you've got to make sure you design your system best you can to prevent that from happening. It is impossible to prevent someone stealing if they want to. So the next best thing is to have your controls designed so you can detect it. So those go hand in hand. It's not just prevention, it's also detection. I could come in today and take 10 laptops out. You can't prevent that. But your controls with your fixed asset accounting should be able to detect that.
Hey, Lisa, can you give a good example of a recent
I can.
event that you uncovered, just to let the new members know that sometimes these things do that?
Yes, I guess it was back in September, we had an accounting employee who did steal, or I hate to use the term embezzle. I think embezzle has a different meaning to me, but maybe we'll just use embezzle. But one of the other accounting staff discovered some irregularities in one of the processes we had, and part of it was all of their checks require a sign-off on by a senior level finance person. And when you sign off, in addition to that, you have to have all the appropriate backup documentation to support that check. So there was one check that did not have a signature on it. So we had an individual who had found some gaps in our system and had stolen close to about $8,000. And it went back over a 2-year period. So when you're thinking about the amount of their budget, for us to have really discovered or uncovered that there was some irregularity there was really pretty amazing. Again, it ended up being about $8,000. I reported it to the insurance company, and he said usually he had dealt with about 7 or 8 instances of embezzlement in the last 2 years, and he said typically it normally would have to reach close to $100,000 before you would ever discover it. So while we didn't prevent it, we were able to detect it. And I thought one of the most positive things about it was the staff that discovered it immediately went to her supervisor. And she and this gentleman are friends in the community. They grew up together, but immediately she reported it. So just really pleased with the outcome. Sorry, and it's unfortunate that it happened. And of course, the staff was dismissed and wanted to pled guilty, and we really went to trial within, I guess it was about a month. Seems like we turned over all of the information to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department and had the trial within just a matter of weeks because the employee wanted to plead guilty. And he did make full restitution and got probation and some community service work. Just accounting principles and accounting system. We do follow generally accepted accounting principles. We strive to design our accounting system, especially it's all electronic. Everybody has different security levels. Again, you can't access all parts of the system and do all parts of the function. So we do have the segregation of duties there. And it is easier to have segregation of duties and rotate duties the larger your department is. I think that's why embezzlement occurs a lot of times in smaller agencies. They have one individual that handles their whole accounting cycle. Account reconciliations. Every month end, before we close our books, we reconcile the cash accounts, the accounts receivable accounts, accounts payable, investments. We have a number of accounts that gets reconciled, especially from the balance sheet. That way we can make sure that, again, everything ties back to some subsidiary ledger or some outside report. Cash management, fortunately, we're in a position where we don't have to delay payments because of cash issues. We have adequate cash flow, so we don't have to manage cash like some agencies have to do. And the Medicaid waiver is called a prepaid inpatient health plan. So Medicaid pays us the first check write of each month. So technically, we are prepaid for that month's service. If they delay their payments like Division of Mental Health did, we would have some serious cash flow issues and not be able to pay providers timely. Investment of idle funds. We're required to invest any idle funds and try to get the most return on our investment. And statute defines what you can invest public funds in, so we have to follow the statute on those investments. And currently, most of our funding is in a cash account that's a checking account that actually is drawing a higher interest rate than we can get through the North Carolina Capital Management Trust at this time. We monitor that. because if the capital management trust gets back up over that percentage, we will shift money back to there. I remember a couple of years ago when our amount of cash was probably not a third of what it is now, but we used to earn about, seems like it was about $300,000 or $350,000 a year in interest, and now on 45 million or whatever, we earn like 80,000 a year or something. It's really just kind of pitiful, but so hopefully one day it will go back up some. Just deposit of funds, we're required by statute if we receive cash or checks, anything over $250 you have to deposit daily, so we adhere to those rules. Typically now, most of our cash we receive or funding, it's all electronic. We just really don't get cash and checks in anymore. And then disbursements have a whole, again, you have to pre-audit all the disbursements. And one of the things we're doing that was an improvement we recognized we could do after the case I just talked about the embezzlement, is we're in the process of implementing what's called positive pay. So every time we create a outlay of cash or a financial transaction, whether it's a paper check or electronic, we send a file to the bank, and before that check clears, they will cross-reference it against the file we've sent. This will keep somebody from either stealing a check and writing it, because you would have to send an electronic file that ties back to that check. External accountability. This is just an example of some of the reports that we do. We have about 15, I think, or so reports monthly that go to the Division of Medical Assistance on our Medicaid utilization. And also quarterly, we have a phone call with Medicaid to report out on our financial position and give them a chance to ask us questions about our financial position. Monthly, we report to the Division of Mental Health. We have an annual independent audit. We have a couple of other reports that are listed up here. We do a lot of reporting internally to other departments, so they can use financial data to track service utilization. A couple that aren't up here, we provide a copy of our annual audit to all the counties that are in our catchment area. And we also have to provide a quarterly report to the counties. I think the counties are required to report that out to their commissioners once a quarter. So we also do that. There are a number of other reports that are done externally. DMH comes in each year and does their own audit and their own settlement with us. They've actually been at Western Highlands for, it seems like about a month now, Chuck, and they're going to be back next week, so I think they're close to getting finished, but sometimes we kid them and think they just like the mountains because they come and they stay for about a month, but anyway, that's just part of it, and we really like the oversight and the accountability. One of the things we've always said is if we're doing something wrong, we want to understand what it is and just try to get it corrected, and I'm one of those that I don't like to do it and then ask later. I like to understand it and try to just carry it out the right way to start with. So that's one of the things that our finance staff really believe in doing. Okay. This is the last section, and this section speaks to how board members get paid their stipend and get paid for your travel. For those of you that are new, you will get paid a stipend for attending trainings, and it's $50 a week. And the way you get paid is Jill will turn in a list, and there seems to be sometimes confusion around this, so I just want to take a minute and make sure we all understand it. Jill will turn in the list, right, Jill?
We'll take it over.
Okay.
If they want to.
Yes. Yes. It is optional. If you don't want to be paid a stipend, you don't have to be paid a stipend. But if you do and you attend, Jill will turn in the attendance to the accounting unit. It gets paid through our payroll. So it will be paid on the 15th of the month. And sometimes there's some confusion about why you haven't been paid yet. But there's typically can be a delay just because of their payroll processing, because we only pay payroll one time a month. So, for example, for this training, Jill will turn it in, this is the 21st or 22nd or whatever, so you will get paid your stipend on March 15th. It will be electronic, so Jill has some information, I think, where she's gonna give you a packet so we can enter you in our payroll system.
If the new members return it promptly,
Okay. Please return it promptly so we can get you paid. When you see this appear on your bank statement, it will see Smoky Mountain Sea payroll, and I'm saying that because there's a difference in when your travel gets paid and when your payroll gets paid. So if it says Smoky Mountain Sea payroll, it's your stipend, you will have Social Security withheld from it. So if you think you're getting 50 and that's part of the issue, you may see something for 44.80 and then you're not sure what you've been paid. So if that occurs, please call and we will make sure that we can explain when you've been paid. You will be issued a W-2 for your stipends. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that. And again, as Jill mentioned, the stipends are optional. Oops. Travel and lodging. Okay, thank you. This is reimbursed per actual expenditures, so it is not taxable, so this will not appear on your W-2. So when you're reimbursed any of your travel or lodging or meals, we need a copy of your actual receipts to reimburse you, and we will reimburse you up to the allowable per diem that's in our policy. And right now, that's $85 for lodging, and what we do is if we have an event like this and you stay here, we will make an exception if the rate here is higher. So we do make some exceptions and our policy allows that. For meals, it's a daily rate if you're in overnight status, and it's $8 for breakfast, $15 for lunch, and $21 for dinner. So it's spelled out in the policy. Jill can help explain it if there are any questions, or I'll be glad to if you have a question about it. If we receive this information by the 10th, so Jill, if you get it, you got to get it to us by the 10th. Accounting will pay it on the 15th. If we receive it after that, but by the 24th, you'll get it paid the last working day of the month. I don't really know what it says on your bank statement. I think it says, I don't know what it says, but it won't say Smoky Mountain payroll. So that's how you'll know what it is. If we're trying to put, we're going to send some backup to you each month that will hopefully tell you exactly what you get paid for. And the reason I really want to cover this, sometimes it's really not very clear and we get a lot of calls about it. So if you ever have a question, go to Jill first, and if she can't answer it, she can follow up with the accounting staff.
but I need it before those dates if you want to get paid on those dates. Because that's the dates I have to submit.
Yes, so try to give it to her about the day before.
Can you say it louder so they can understand?
I would recommend more than a day, because if all of you give it to Jill on the 9th, then she's gonna be scrambling to try and get everybody's done in a very short time period.
Thank you,
Plus, she does other people's in the executive offices, not just board members, so she does lots of people.
So before I wrap up, are there any questions about any of our reporting, accountability, budget, etc.? Or stipends? Michael?
One question. You know if there's ever been any discussion at the state level about the state treasurer or whomever establishing a fund that LME, MCOs, and other state agencies could invest in that would be more akin to the type of securities, for example, that Prudential, for example, offers in a 401k, because I know Smoky, as an example, has, we need some for cash flow, But other things we have sitting there all the time, and we draw very little interest on. I know the same folks who provide 401k plan can provide other types of instruments. And I just as an example, I was looking at my own 401k this morning. Probably, I think it was about 5 or 6 plans that are offered there. Small cap, large cap, small cap index, growth, et cetera. All have had in the neighborhood of, let's say it's 24% growth. Wouldn't we like for Skokie to make up deficits in other areas by having even half that? Has there ever been any discussion of the state setting up a plan with some kind of, and I know that seems odd, and I know that it's not currently allowed by statute, but has there ever been any discussion of setting something like that up?
I'm not aware, especially of any recent discussion around that, and that's really why the North Carolina Capital Management Trust got created and set up, and that was to allow investments of public entities through that agency, or at least that's the way I've understood it. But it is really prescribed in the statute about what governmentals can invest in, and if you just think about Orange County, California, I don't know, maybe it's been 10 years ago, whatever it is, where they were investing in something that was pretty aggressive, and they...
Right, and I'm not suggesting anything like that, but it just seems to me that the state could come up with some kind of instrument that is not aggressive, but that would allow certainly a better return than what most of us are able to.
Yeah, our return is like, it's like 0.03%, or it's just something that's just kind of unbelievable to me, but
Yeah.
we usually, every year we check. Last year we looked at even doing some tiered investments to take them on out 12 and 24 months, and there was just no difference in it. But we do keep in close touch with the Capital Management Trust, which is the other option we have, just to see what their rates are. I do think it would be great if we could do something different, that we could assure the safety of
Yeah, I mean, it just
funds.
seems like, you wouldn't want to put all your eggs in one basket, like California situation, but if you could invest 10% of that portion, which, is historically kept in a reserve or whatever, and this type of investment and another 25% in this kind of investment, so that, I mean, we've got to quit thinking like the 1950s kind of investment. Sorry.
Tracy, can you work on that statute?
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
Thank you.
It sounds like an interesting idea, especially in a short session of that.
I don't think we have this story, and I'm just saying that long term, it seems like there's got to be a better. We really consider what we pay in administrative costs and so forth, what you get in interest is a lot.
I agree, Michael. Is there anything else? Thank you.
I believe,
Well, we better get their lunch and just keep talking.
yeah, I think so. Jill, is lunch being brought in?
We're gonna have box lunches. We had told them to be ready at 12.
Okay.
This will work on lunch.
Jay, do you want to go ahead and do your part, and then I'll... Do you want to go ahead and do yours, and then I can kind of do mine over lunch?
Sure.
Understand? The only thing I have to cover for you all is compliance. It's kind of important, so.
I wasn't quite ready. fast. When you look around this room at the people who are here and consider the enormous healthcare expertise that's in this room, administrative expertise, financial expertise, not to mention local and state legislative expertise, it's pretty inspiring. It's pretty astonishing, really. I hope the new ones here are inspired by what you've heard so far. We've had some great presentations, and some of the old timers, I think, are probably saying, well, based on what they're telling us, where we are and where we're going, here we go again. And now, you go from the sublime to the ridiculous, because we're going to talk about Robert's Rules of Order. And how do you make that interesting? How do you make that relevant? Robert's Rules are in your bylaws as our guide. They haven't always been in our bylaws, because at one time we had a different way of doing things. We had what was called the Suggested Rules of Procedure for a Small Government Board. And it was contained in this little pamphlet here. Probably some of you commissioners have adopted this as your rules of procedure. It's very slender. I would compare it to where we are in our game now. This would be like the K through 5 rules of procedure, okay? And it says, excuse me, I can't read this. It says in the back, however, the last rule, there's only 28 rules in it, it says, Board shall refer to the current edition of Robert's Rules of Order to answer procedural questions not resolved in these rules, as long as Robert's Rules of Order does not conflict with North Carolina law or with the spirit of these rules. And then the comment says, Robert's Rules of Order was designed to govern large legislative assemblies, and many of its provisions may be inappropriate for small boards. Nevertheless, it is a good source of parliamentary procedure. Care should simply be taken to adjust Robert's Rules to meet the needs of a small local government board. Well, when we were going through the bylaws, we said that's exactly where we're at now. This is no longer where we're at. As an area authority, as an MCO, as an LME, we're beyond this level right here. We are to this level. This is like 1/8 thick. This is like 1 3/4 inches. The difference between the two is the difference between where we used to be and where we're going. You've seen where we are right now, and you've heard people stand at this podium and tell you where we're going and how we're going to get there. We have gone, that pyramid started up here at 42 area authorities and it's going down forward. Well, it's just like these procedures here. are going from 1/8 of an inch to 1 3/4 inches. That's where we are. That's one way that I feel that Robert's Rules of Order may be relevant to you. You're getting ready to go to the doctoral dissertation level of Robert's Rules as opposed to the K through 5 level of Robert's Rules. That's what this organization is going to be doing. And one of the key features of Robert's Rules was pointed out in a session we had last summer by Judy Poe. And I'm going to, I didn't warn you that I was going to put you in the spotlight, but I'm going to. We don't often have debates over parliamentary procedure in our board meetings. It's pretty rare. And if any of y'all have seen Lincoln, the movie Lincoln, we very seldom have debates that get to that level where they're trying to pass the 13th Amendment. A lot of times we have very orderly, polite, civil meetings, and we don't get into the Robert's Rules of Order book. But we did back in the summer, and it involved a situation where this book didn't work because we couldn't find what we needed to find in this book. And it's not in that book. It's in Robert's Rules. But the issue is this. The counties were being asked to vote on whether or not we should put the question to the separate counties about whether we were going to go forward with the new board of governance. And that was a requirement of the statute. You had to say to the counties, approve this new governance statute, which we did approve. But there was a moment when, and the counties were very resistant to this idea. I think you've gotten that flavor. The counties didn't want to be out of the business of doing mental health because those commissioners, when they go home, they talk to their constituents, and that's where the rubber hits the road. So there was a lot of debate about what we ought to do, and one of the county members who did not want to go forward with this new law that we have enacted and are going forward with, moved to table the issue. It was on the floor. And what was on the floor is, shall we send this to the counties for their approval? And I, the lawyer, said, well, the motion to table takes precedent over the issue that's on the floor. And Judy Poe, a county commissioner of many years, attending many meetings, said no, it doesn't. So if you look, now this is another edition of Robert's Rules. It's got a better quote in it, that's why I'm using it. This, as a matter of fact, this is Robert's Rules here. This is the 10th edition, newly revised Robert's Rules. That's the one we're actually going by, but I want to quote from the one that Mr. Robert, or General Robert, wrote himself. And it has an interesting statement in here about the issue of laying on the table. This motion has high privileges, outranking every debatable question and being undebatable itself, and requiring only a majority vote for its adoption, because it is for the best interest of the Assembly that it have the power to instantly lay aside any business to attend to something more urgent. Now that's the way I remembered it in my mind when I said this has precedent over the issue that's on the floor. The fundamental principles of parliamentary law require that every motion which suppresses a question for the session should be open to free debate, unless debate is limited or closed. In assemblies having a short session lasting for only a few hours, a bare majority can lay on the table every objectionable question and thus suppress it without permitting debate. This is an abuse of the motion that often interferes with the harmony of voluntary organizations. The reasons for giving it such high privileges are based on the theory that the question to be laid aside is only laid aside temporarily. The motion is very valuable if used for some legitimate purpose, but if used habitually to suppress questions, then it should require a 2/3 vote and have precedence over the motion that's on the floor. Which means that Judy was absolutely right. What was the attempt that was being made was to not move the question on the floor to a vote, to take it to the counties for the county's approval so we could move forward. So I was overruled, and the motion to lay the question on the table was set aside, and we proceeded with a vote which took the thing to the counties, which moved the whole organization forward. And the reason I'm bringing this up, I was struggling over the past week trying to make Robert's rules relevant, maybe even interesting to you, is that we've always had in our organization here, the principle firmly adhered to is that we should debate the issues that are before us thoroughly. We should air them out. Everybody should speak up. And you'll find that if we continue in the tradition that we've adhered to in the past, that you will be talking, speaking up, and motions to lay things on the table and not take them up should be rigorously avoided. So don't try to table something as important as something like that this past summer. We'll be using Robert's Rules of Order whenever we have to. Most of the time, the chair or the director very effectively move the debate, and we don't have to get down in the weeds, but occasionally you do. But we have moved on beyond the simple little procedures that the school government has supplied, not only in our procedure, but as an organization. There are a couple of other statutes that apply to what we do. They're almost as boring as Robert's Rules, but I've got to tell you what they are because it's part of your training. The meeting that you are in right now is a public meeting. Even though the doors are closed, any member of the public can walk into this meeting at any time and sit down and participate in this meeting. It is the public policy of the state of North Carolina that any public body be open to the public, and we are undoubtedly a public body. You're no longer a hospital board, you're no longer a nonprofit corporation or a profit corporation. You're no longer a club, you are a public body by definition. Whereas the public bodies that administer the legislative, policymaking, quasi-judicial, administrative, and advisory functions of North Carolina and its political subdivisions exist solely to conduct the public's business, it is the public policy of North Carolina that the hearings, deliberations, and actions of these bodies be conducted openly. So that's the way we're going to proceed in every meeting that you attend, with some exceptions. This is an official meeting. We could possibly make it an unofficial meeting, but it would be pretty hard. It will blend into kind of an unofficial meeting as we adjourn, but then after adjournment, it's not really an official meeting. But at times, we are not really taking up the business of the public, we're socializing. But when we announce that we're having a public meeting, and we have to announce it, it has to be published. When we have that meeting, it's open to the public, and we don't close it unless there's certain exceptions, which I'll follow in a minute, apply. Also, as you can see, Jill is taking full and accurate minutes of all the official meetings, including the minutes of the closed sessions. So there's a record of what we do, and that record, as I'll tell you in a minute, is a public record. So We'll have open meetings that will be announced, and if we have a certain array of questions that we've got to take up that are privileged with confidence, we'll go into a closed session. Those particular permitted purposes are set forth in the statute, and as you know, since you attended last night, we went into a closed session to consult with an attorney about litigation and to consider the qualifications of the employment of our director. Personnel, in other words. Lawyer and personnel are the two issues that you're going to see over and over again in a closed session. Sometimes there are some other things, but there are 9 permitted purposes which you can go into closed session. And each time we do that, you'll see staff get up, walk out because they aren't members of the board. Some staff, like the recording clerk, will have to stay to keep records of it, and the attorneys will stay. And anybody who is asked to stay for the purpose of discussing what needs to be discussed in a closed session. And that means that even people as eminent as Lanier Campsler has to get up and leave when we have a closed session. And I thought that was pretty amazing that the former secretary would have to leave a closed session for area authority. But that's the way we run the show, and that's the way we've got to do business by law. So there are basically 3 types of meetings that we're going to have. One is regular, and you've got a schedule for that you approved yesterday, so you know when those are going to be, and they're published and available to the public, so the public will know where they're going to be, when they're going to be. There are special meetings that are sometimes called because you have to take care of business that is in between those regular meetings. And then sometimes you have emergency meetings. We have had emergency meetings in the past. They're very rare, but I'm aware of some, and I believe some of you have attended some of the emergency meetings that we've had. And they don't require the same kind of notice, but you do have to let the public know that you have had the meeting after you've gone through that particular emergency. And also, these meetings can be recorded. And as you know, Jerry has been recording all of the meetings that we've had except for the closed session. I guess you turned your camera off then, didn't you?
I took it outside.
Okay. So, and you can record it with a tape recorder. You can record it with a camera. Any way you want to record it, it can be recorded by the public. So, if you see that happening, that's not unusual. It is permissible. And here's another feature of that recording. Jerry, if he wants to, can take it down to WLOS and say, put this on the air and publish it to the entire world. So the meetings that you attend are public, and they can be recorded, and they can be sent out to the entire world. So this is a little bit different maybe from where you might have been at your last board meeting. And one last thing about this particular law is that the General Court of Justice has the jurisdiction to enter mandatory or prohibitory injunctions to enjoin the threatened violation of this article. So if you tried to keep somebody out, if we said, Jerry, we just don't like you filming this, he could go down the street and talk to the judge about it, and we'd be in trouble. Okay. That's about as much detail as I think you need to know about a public meeting. We could get a whole lot more detail than that, but I'm sure that Tracy has a lot more important stuff than getting into the details. But here's another important point about public meetings. There's another statute, a different chapter called public records. And a public record shall mean all documents, papers, letters, maps, books, photographs, films, sound recordings, etc., made or received pursuant or in connection with the transaction of public business by any agency of North Carolina government or its subdivisions. The key words there are may or receive. If you receive information or you make information, you have made a public record by any means that you make it, whether you do it on your phone with a text message, or whether you do it on an email, whether you do it the way Jill's doing it by keeping a record, whether Lisa creates a report that she sends out, whether Brian writes a letter to the governor. No matter what you do in this organization at just about any level, just about, not all levels, but just about any level, becomes a public record. And if someone asks for that public record, this organization has to turn it over. Every custodian of a public record shall permit any record in the custodian's custody to be inspected and examined at reasonable times and under reasonable supervision by any person, and shall as promptly as possible furnish copies thereof upon the payment of any fees as may be prescribed by law. So, once a record is made or received, it becomes a public record. And if somebody wants to get it from this organization, all they've got to do is make a document request, and within a reasonable time, we have to say, come copy it, or we have to copy it and send it, or we have to make some sort of reasonable accommodation for that person's request. It's kind of like a Freedom of Information Act on a state level, not exactly, because the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply to the state, but the records request that comes under Chapter 132 does. So if we, state agency, create that record, it's a public record and it has to be made available. Now, there are a number of exceptions, some of which apply to this agency, and I'm sure you can probably think of some that would be confidential. For example, the closed session minutes that we might keep can be withheld from someone who requests a public record request, because of the confidential record that we have of the confidential session. If it's disclosed and would defeat the purpose of going into a closed session, can be withheld. There are some other things that that can be withheld: Social Security numbers, certain personnel information, criminal investigations, like the one Lisa mentioned, for example. A lot of things that you might expect can be withheld, can legitimately be withheld. Those instances when we've had to comply with this, basically the procedure would be to have the attorneys look at it and make a decision about it, winnow out what can't be turned over, and then go ahead and comply with the request. I've done this many times, and that's the way we do it. We take care of it. We don't withhold that information. If it's a legitimate request, we turn it over. But if it's confidential and it fits within the exceptions, we observe those too. So that's the way we handle records and meetings. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to go there. And I know Mike's going to ask a hard one. Yeah.
You know I always have one. Can you explain the logic? I was a little bit surprised last night when we asked our non-voting folks not to come into a closed session. And I can understand that there might be situations where they might have a conflict of interest, just as any one of us might have a conflict of interest. And it seems to me that just because they're non-voting doesn't mean they might not have pertinent input into a situation. And I'm not clear on what the logic is there.
Tracy, do you want to take a stab at that? You just stood up.
No, I didn't stand up for that. I think it's a couple different things. First, we want to make sure we're preserving the attorney-client privilege. And I really want to do some more research before we
personnel.
Yeah, and I think that just had to do again with the status of being provided in our network, having access to that non-confidential.
So you say
information. It's gonna be on a case-by-case basis, and I think it will be up to the board to decide that each, I'm not gonna suggest to you that, Mr. Sumter should be excluded from every closed session, because that may not be appropriate at all.
I thought that was the suggestion last night, that it was going to be from here on out, and I just didn't understand that logic, because I think any
If
member
I
of the board.
implied that last night, I apologize. It's gonna depend on what we are going into closed session for.
And this may be one of those things that the bylaws committee chair will write down on a note, consider, and come back and report to us on. Because we're sort of experimenting here with a new type of government structure where we have non-voting members that are required by law to be on our board. We don't really know exactly what that is.
It just seems to me that they certainly have right of input, even if they have not a right to cast a vote.
I agree with you.
That might be our first bylaws amendment. Any other questions?
I won't put any pressure on you, Jay, but you're the only thing that stands between all of them and their delicious box of lunch.
So if I quit now, you'll give me a high grade on my card, right? Okay.
Everybody go get your lunch, come back, and we'll start right back up.
Yeah, we'll entertain you over lunch.
Everybody.
Tracy.
I know it's tough.
We quit, so.
Yeah, I know it's tough, and you guys are trying to enjoy your lunch. We've got a couple more topics we need to cover. Compliance is really the most important one, just from a training perspective. But I also want to spend a few minutes talking about human rights and due process. And first, just kind of, as an organization, why is this so important? And, there's sort of two aspects to that. It's important because respecting human rights and protecting people's due process rights, it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do, it's the ethical thing to do. But it also has the added value of when you do that, you avoid litigation, you avoid risk, and you avoid a lot of extra costs. And the example I always use, I'll use it again today, even though we have a lot of other people here, is not suggesting that they've done anything wrong, but Cardinal has spent upwards of $1 million on legal fees on a due process case in federal court. And my goal at Smoky Mountain is that we don't ever have to spend that kind of legal fees on due process, because that's money that's not being spent on services. And while I was at the Attorney General's office, I was involved in two separate federal class action lawsuits involving due process. The first is actually called McCartney versus Chancellor, and I believe you might remember that case. And that was a case that involved value options. It was a behavioral health case. It concerned issues about value options, discouraging people from filing appeals. Again, not suggesting any of that happened, but these were just the allegations. Discouraging people from filing appeals, not including appeal rights and notices, things like that. The second class action lawsuit I was involved in was personal care services litigation, which also involved Mr. Chancellor.
I just want to tell you, you go in to apply for a loan, the question says, are you involved in any lawsuit? And I would say, yeah, 200 and some.
He was a frequent defendant. So I do have a lot of experience around due process. It's one of my kind of specialty areas, which is, I like the word Lisa uses. I don't know if that's pitiful or not, but it is one of my areas of expertise. So First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about human rights, and I've kind of lumped this into a category I call healthcare rights. And again, this is just a general categories. It's not an exhaustive list. There are far more rights than I have listed out here. But people have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. They have the right to have their protected health information treated with privacy and security. They have the right to participate in decisions about their health care, including the development of a person-centered plan and treatment goals. People have the right to voice complaints and ask questions. Our consumers have the right to be free from seclusion or restraint. People have the right to refuse treatment, and they have the right to seek a second opinion. And people have the right to their medical records, and they also have the right to make corrections to those medical records if they believe that they contain errors. And then finally, people have the right to treatment in the most natural, age-appropriate, and least restrictive environment. So these just, in my mind, kind of sum up. Obviously, there are tons of other human rights out there in terms of free speech and religion and all kinds of other rights, but since we're here to talk about health care, I think these are the most important rights as they relate to health care. And 122C also has a very specific declaration about state policy on clients' rights. It is the policy of the state of North Carolina to assure basic human rights to each client of a facility. These rights include the right to dignity, privacy, humane care, and freedom from mental and physical abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Each facility shall assure to each client the right to live as normally as possible when receiving care and treatment. And Smokey plays a role in making sure that people's rights are respected. One of the things that we do in care coordination, which I probably didn't touch on enough, is that in the IDD side, our care coordinators are required under the waiver to make a monthly visit to individuals in their community, if they live in a facility, to their facility, to ensure exactly this, that their rights are being respected, that they are being well taken care of. And this is because CMS wants to make sure that somebody is laying eyes on this person on a regular basis to make sure that they are okay. Because people who are on the innovations waiver meet ICF level of care criteria, which means they are not able to ensure that for themselves. So what exactly is due process when we talk about due process? You can think of it sort of on the criminal side. You know, due process is the right to have a statement of charges made against you, the notice of what your crimes are, and the opportunity to be heard before your life or liberty is taken away from you. So you translate that over into the Medicaid world, and what that means is you have notice and the opportunity to be heard whenever a Medicaid service is denied, reduced, terminated, or suspended, or if we fail to act with reasonable promptness, which in the managed care world is 14 calendar days from when someone makes a request, and it's shorter for some of the expedited services. And the reason this due process right exists is because Medicaid is an entitlement program. This is a very important key piece of the Medicaid program. When someone has been found eligible for Medicaid, it becomes an entitlement for that person. And this was first discussed in a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1970 called Goldberg versus Kelly. This was actually a food stamp case, but the principle of that case was that welfare benefits are entitlements once you have been found eligible. And this applies regardless of whether Medicaid is under fee-for-service or managed care. Now, one thing to keep in mind, state-funded services are not an entitlement because state-funded services are based on a limited pot of money. Medicaid is not based on a limited pot of money. If it's medically necessary, you're entitled to it regardless of whether North Carolina has allocated enough money for it or not. But state-funded services are not like that. State-funded services, it's based on a very specific allocation for the year, and so they're not an entitlement. We do have an appeal process for state-funded services, but but it is different than the Medicaid appeal process. It does not involve the Office of Administrative Hearings. Now, please keep in mind, we can place limits on services, but the criteria that we have to use is medical necessity, clinical coverage and service definition criteria, clinical coverage policies. We talk about those all the time. You hear us say clinical coverage policy, this, that, and the other. These are policies that are promulgated by the Division of Medical Assistance through what's called the Physicians Advisory Group, the PAG. And they have the force and effect of an administrative code. Essentially what happened was the General Assembly said, you know what? Legislators, Rules Review Commission people, they don't know the first thing about health care. They can't establish clinical coverage policy, but we need to have a process for that to happen. And so it goes through a physician's advisory group, but it has the same force and effect as a rule. And service definition criteria, those are for the state-funded services, state-funded service definitions. There are also specific requirements in the waiver around eligibility and coverage criteria for services. Practice parameters, and Dr. Heck left, but I don't know if there are any other clinicians in the room. Practice parameters would be those things like the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry puts out parameters on what is the best treatment modality for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example. And those are things that we can look at so that if some practitioner comes to us with a request for something that is just so far outside the realm of what this National Academy is recommending for a particular diagnosis, that might be a basis to deny. We have to be consistent and we have to use written policies and procedures. And then this last piece down here at the bottom, I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. If you take nothing away from anything that I have told you today, please remember this. We do not, will not, cannot ever cut services for budget or cost-cutting goals. That is not what we do. And, you know, there have been instances where state employees or board members have made public statements about how we're losing money and we got to cut back on such and such service. And I can tell you, and I believe that Mr. Secretary would support me in this, that there is a particular advocate who lives in Mecklenburg County. His name is Doug C. I respect Doug quite a lot. Doug is an advocate for Medicaid recipients. And if he hears that on the news, he was on the phone with me at the Attorney General's office like that, to say, what is DHHS going to do about that statement? That statement is not appropriate. EPSDT. All right, I may have to do a quiz here. Without looking at the slide, what does EPSDT stand for?
Early prevention, or early screening, periodic prevention, diagnostic treatment.
That is so good. It is the Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment Program. This is a major component of the Medicaid program for children under the age of 21. It entitles Medicaid beneficiaries in that age category to medically necessary services, screening, diagnostic, and treatment services that are necessary to correct and ameliorate defects in physical and mental illnesses and conditions. This last piece is the important part, regardless of limits on coverage. So, let's use an example. If intensive in-home, if the clinical coverage criteria says you can only get a maximum of 30 units of intensive in-home a month. I'm making that up. I don't know what the criteria is. But let's say that's what it said. Okay? Adults over the age of 21 are limited to 30 units a month. No matter, they could have 50 physicians say they need more than 30 units a month. They're not going to get more because that's what the clinical coverage policy says. Okay? A child under 21 might be able to go over that limit if it meets this criteria. Okay? So this is just a really, really important part of the Medicaid program. Now, why do I have this slide here? I like to give a tiny little history lesson on EPSDT that I learned from a registered nurse who's worked for Medicaid for many years named Jane Klasky. The reason we have EPSTT, it was not part of the original Medicaid Act. I just think this is fascinating. They were doing some studies in the ramping up toward the Vietnam War and when they were conscripting young men for service. And doctors were reporting back to the military that there were a very high percentage of preventable conditions in young men from very rural and very urban, very poor environments. And they were saying, had they had some kind of access to just one doctor visit, this condition could have been prevented when they were 3 years old, but now they're not fit for service because they didn't get appropriate medical care in their youth. And so as a result of that, a report was generated. I believe it started under the Kennedy administration and ended up under the Johnson administration. And President Johnson pushed through Congress this addition to the Medicaid Act called EPSTT. And I just think it's fascinating that, you know, because the military needed it, we got this wonderful benefit for children. But that's really the genesis of it. It was to make sure that we would have young people fit for service. So the EPSTT criteria, it actually has to be something that's listed in the Social Security Act. And the reason that's important is because if you'll remember from when we talked about innovations, a lot of those services are not services that are covered under the Social Security Act. So those things like respite, home modifications, vehicle adaptations, those limits do apply to children because they don't fall within EPSTT. Okay, so most of innovations, EPSTT does not apply to. EPSTT primarily applies on the mental health and substance abuse side in our world. It actually has to be a medical service. So, you know, it can't be voodoo or laying on of hands. It actually has to be a real medical service. It has to be generally recognized as an accepted method of medical practice or treatment. The example I use for that is there's a service out there called hyperbaric oxygen treatment for children with autism. And there's very differing opinions upon as whether that's an accepted method of treatment for autism. It's very dangerous. There have been one instance where a house was set on fire by the equipment. So it's not something that a lot of Medicaid programs are covering under EPSTT. It can't be experimental or investigational, which means you can't cover clinical trials, like cancer trials that somebody might be doing at UNC or something like that. And it has to be safe, and it has to be effective. So the way it works in behavioral health managed care is that either the provider or the care coordinator submits a request in our electronic authorization system. For most of it, it's the provider. On IDD innovations, the care coordinator under the innovations waiver is responsible for that role. They work with the family to develop the plan. They have to submit whatever plan the family wants. They can't just say, you know what, I think this plan that they're coming up with doesn't make any sense, I'm going to submit my own plan. They have to respect the family's wishes, but it is their role to actually submit the request. There cannot be any discouragement. That was a huge part of the value options litigation. We actually ended up with a script. And it was kind of funny, I was doing some training with Smoky staff, and they all remembered that script because it was horrible. It prevented people from having treatment discussions, but we couldn't do that because that was the only way we could satisfy the advocates that the appropriate language was being used when staff was talking to consumers and providers. So you can't discourage people from asking for something, and you can't discourage people from filing an appeal. We do have an unable to process step, which is if we get a request that doesn't contain all of the necessary elements for us to actually process it. So like a big example would be the Medicaid identification number that they put in there. It doesn't match the name that is in there. We can't process that. So that'll be kicked back to the provider. There won't be an appeal. They'll have to fix that before it can go through. We have a peer review process, and that would take me a while to go through, but just these are reviewed by clinical peers of the providers who are requesting the service.
We have to issue the decision within 14 calendar days. It's 3 days for an expedited service, and that can be extended under the regulations. If it's denied, reduced, or terminated, we have to issue a notice of action. It has to include the reason, and it has to tell people how to file an appeal and include an appeal form. Not everything can be appealed, and this has been somewhat challenging for some of our consumers and families. The regulations, this is all coming from the Code of Federal Regulations, has a list of exactly the only things that can be appealed, and it all has to do with actions about your services. So if we are denying a service, suspending a service, reducing a service, terminating a service, those are all things that can be appealed. But if you are just generally unhappy with Smoky, if you are generally unhappy with your provider, or if something has happened to you that does not impact your service, that cannot be appealed. You can file a grievance, and we have a grievance process, and we have trained staff who try to work out those issues with families. And the biggest example I can give you is relative as provider. The Office of Administrative Hearings recently issued a decision in one of Cardinal's cases in which they confirmed this view, which is that relative as provider, and that's a situation under the innovations waiver, parents who want to actually be the provider of service have to request permission. This was not something that Smoky made up. This is in the innovations waiver. This came from CMS. And there are pros and cons, no matter how you look at it. But one of the things that happened is when Cardinal denied someone's request to be the relative as provider, they wanted to go to the Office of Administrative Hearings to appeal that. And OAH said, this doesn't actually impact your service. Your service has been authorized. You as a parent can't deliver the service, and you have to let a private provider deliver the service, but the service itself has been authorized. So this is the kind of example of things that cannot be appealed to the Office of Administrative Hearings at this time. So the appeal process, just kind of want to make everybody aware of the timelines, because you may get calls from families or consumers, and I think it would be helpful for you to know what the timeline is to appeal. So people have 30 days from the date they receive one of our notices of decision to file a request for reconsideration with us. And this is really important. They cannot go directly to OAH. The waiver requires them to exhaust their appeal with us before they go to the Office of Administrative Hearings. And that is a change from fee-for-service, and so I just want to make sure everybody understands that. After we have the reconsideration, Smoky has 30 days to issue a decision about whether they're going to uphold our original decision or overturn it. From that date, the consumer has 30 days to request a state fair hearing with the Office of Administrative Hearings. So it's 30, 30, 30. It's pretty easy to remember. Those are the time frames. The first step at the Office of Administrative Hearings is mediation, and that is informal, it's voluntary, it's confidential, and it's legally binding. The next step, if mediation fails, although I will say the percentages on mediation are it's running anywhere between 85 and 90% of the cases that go to mediation are resolved at mediation. This was actually something that went through the legislature maybe 2-3 years ago. It has been very successful. What OAH does is they have a contract with the Mediation Network of North Carolina, which is a private network of certified mediators who hear these cases. So they're not affiliated with DHHS, they're not affiliated with the MCOs, they're not affiliated with OAH. They are completely neutral, and they hear these and try to help the parties come to an agreement. The vast majority of them get resolved because what happens is sometime during that mediation, the provider submits more information that justifies the service. I'm just going to throw this number out there, but I'd say probably at least half of the denials that are issued by Smoky or any other MCO have to do with the fact that the provider did not adequately submit documentation to justify the service. And so that comes up in the mediation, and then suddenly we get the documentation that we need. And so this is something we're actually working on with our comprehensive providers. We've been having discussions about some contract performance measures around that to try and improve that on the provider side. OAH has 55 days to actually hold a hearing and make a decision, which is a very short time frame. So the hearings are done by phone. They're somewhat informal, although witnesses are sworn in. And the judges can act somewhat as advocates for the consumers during those appeals. There's also a distinction in managed care between maintenance of service and continuation of benefits. Not going to spend a lot of time on that, but under fee-for-service, you were entitled to continue having your service paid for during the appeal process. And under managed care, your service is only paid for until the end of that initial authorization. And Smokey's not required to continue your service during the appeal process. That is one of the biggest differences between fee-for-service and managed care on the due process side. So this was the final session law that I had not gotten to when we were looking at all the different legislative changes. This came out last year. This was Senate Bill 553. And the purpose of this law was to clean up some of the conflicting provisions that we had between state law and federal law around consumer appeals. So that has been clarified. It's also clarified that OAH only has jurisdiction over MCOs to the extent they are hearing Medicaid consumer appeals. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. It also defined closed network and network provider for the first time, which has been very helpful for us. So, provider appeals. So I think just the big thing for people to be aware is that the federal courts have universally held that the Medicaid program did not create any rights for providers. There's a stack of cases this high that say that's not why the Medicaid program was created. It was created to create rights for beneficiaries and recipients, not for providers. That said, providers do have a right to get paid for services that they deliver. But what that does mean is that if you are terminated from the Medicaid program or if you are denied participation in the Medicaid program or in our network, you do not have a right to appeal. Smokey does have a reconsideration process for sanctions, for adverse actions that affect your network participation, and for overpayments, but there is no right at Smokey to appeal the denial of an application to join our network. We try to treat this as a contractual relationship. We have contracts with all of our providers, and our view is that these disputes should be handled as any other contract dispute would be handled. And then I always include this slide. I do this training for staff. I've done it for all the MCOs around the state on due process. It's a very abbreviated version of my due process training, and they always look so confused at the end that I always felt like I had to tell them not to feel bad. This is very complicated stuff. And I have yet another Medicaid quote from another judge. I always like this one because of the end statement where it says, the court has nothing but sympathy for officials who must administer or interpret the Medicaid Act. So at least someone, somewhere, has sympathy for us. Okay, so now we're going to cover compliance, because this is one of those required things we need to do. First thing I'm going to talk about is your code of ethics, and this is something we added to the bylaws. This was not in your bylaws, and we felt that you needed to have a code of ethics in your bylaws. I asked Rick last night, and Rick, if you looked through the bylaws, you okay with the code of ethics, everything? This was before the meeting. He said, yeah, it's just no fist fights. I got it. So if anybody needs to remember what the code of ethics is about, it means no fist fights. But I tried to kind of sum it up in some bullet points. It's about being respectful. It's about avoiding conflicts of interest. No gifts, no financial advantages or personal benefits from your service on the board. You have to respect government property. You cannot speak on behalf of the board unless you've been authorized by the board to do so. Confidentiality, that's a big one. Your code of ethics in your bylaws that you all have agreed to state that you must keep confidential matters we discuss in closed session. So if we go into closed session, it's because that is a confidential matter that is entitled to be kept confidential under the open meetings laws, and we are reminding you to please keep all of that confidential when we do go into closed session. And that includes also any time we ever have discussions, if that should happen, about a particular consumer or anybody's personal health information, that also must remain confidential. The code tells you need to be familiar with your rules and your bylaws and your policies so that the meetings can go smoothly. So I think Judy is the recognized expert on that front. She clearly knows Robert's Rules of Orders better than Jay, so good for Judy. And you have to be in compliance with all the laws, rules, and regulations. You have to have regular attendance. And that last one is one that I really like. Basically is saying that everything that you do in your life should enhance the integrity of this board. So that is our code of ethics in a nutshell. On the conflict of interest, the policy that we have at Smoky, and I'm just going to be very upfront with you and tell you, so you know I've been here since December. Smoky has, I think, a little over 600 policies. I'm slowly working my way through them. The conflict of interest policy does need to be updated. I noticed that early this morning because it talks about the CFAC representatives being non-voting members, which is not correct. So I've noted that down, and we'll add that to the bylaws and policy committee to get that corrected. But the policy says you have to properly disclose any actual potential or perceived conflict of interest that may arise as you are active members of your communities. It's intended to supplement but not replace any state laws that are out there about conflict of interest, and we're asking that both the fact and the appearance of a conflict be avoided. So the procedure is that first and foremost, everybody on the board has a duty to disclose, affirmatively disclose conflict of interest. We shouldn't have to pry it out of you. You should come forward with it. The other policy we have is that you should come forward and identify matters that you believe you should be recused from voting on. And the way that works in the policy is that if you've identified a potential conflict, the board then, the remaining members of the board consider that and vote on whether they think it is a conflict, and if it is, how it should be handled. It will be a standing agenda item at every meeting. And we do have a list of providers, stakeholders, and vendors available if anybody needs to see that to double check whether they have any conflicts. You have to do an annual disclosure, and it needs to be updated as needed. That's what the standing agenda item is for, is an opportunity for you to update. But everybody in their packet has a conflict of interest disclosure form. And what I'm asking is that if you have not already filled it out and given it to Jill, that you do so before you leave here today. And then that way at the next board meeting, we can review any potential conflicts that have been identified and make decisions about them going forward. Violation of the conflict of interest policy is grounds for removal from the board under our bylaws. So what kind of things need to be disclosed? Essentially, it's any actual potential or perceived conflict in relationship with stakeholders, consumers, families, providers, or vendors with which we conduct business of any kind. So that's kind of why you might need that list of providers, stakeholders, and vendors we contract with, because I can tell you I don't know who they all are off the top of my head, and so I'm sure you guys don't either. We use the definition of financial interest as it's defined by the IRS, and that's in your policy. And it also covers any personal, professional, or familial affiliation. And the policy defines familial relationships. It's kind of obvious and basic. I'm not going to go over that too much. Has everybody had a chance to look at their disclosure form? Jill, I believe it's attached to the back of the policy. It's the last page of the conflict of interest policy. So if everybody could just take a look at that. I'm gonna stay all afternoon, so if anybody has any questions about how to fill that out, or if you need a little more time, just let me know and you can shoot those over to Jill, but I'd really like to have them, in advance of the next board meeting so that we can go over any potential conflicts at the next board meeting.
It's after the minutes toward the beginning of the packet.
So that's your code of ethics and your conflict of interest. Now I'm just going to kind of give you a basic compliance overview. This is something that's new to your bylaws. This board has the ultimate responsibility for compliance, and that's the way it needs to be as a healthcare organization. One of the things that we've made very clear in the bylaws is that anyone can directly report a compliance violation to the board if they need to do so. We do have a 1-800 number for staff and providers to report any potential fraud and abuse or compliance violations, and that's included in my slides. But there is the option for people to directly report to the board, and the board does have the option to hire independent investigator and counsel if necessary. And part of the reason for that is, even though I'm responsible at the organization level for corporate compliance, I report to Brian. So therefore, it would be difficult for me to report to the board any potential compliance issues involving Brian. Obviously, I can't report compliance issues involving myself other than self-disclosure. So that's why you always need to have that ability, when we have that kind of situation, for the board to hire an independent investigator and counsel if necessary. I think that's another good reason why for us to have a separate board attorney to help handle those types of issues that may arise. And the example I think I would give you all, as painful as it is, of something that probably could have been prevented had we had a more effective compliance program, I guess it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would be everything that happened with your former director and all of those issues. Would you kind of agree with that, Jay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what we've established at Smoky is an effective compliance program that addresses and incorporates guidelines from the Office of Inspector General, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So corporate compliance in general, what does that mean? It means that we have a working environment that supports ethical business practices, employee commitment to doing the right thing, reporting of non-compliance, and ongoing program monitoring to prevent, detect, and deter non-compliant practices. And you heard Lisa talk about that in the finance department. This is not just something that we do on the front end, it's something we do on the back end. We are ongoing program monitoring to detect it and prevent it. So let's kind of talk about why do we have to have a compliance program. First is a philosophical reason. Some of Smoky's values are integrity, responsibility, quality, and caring. And our values reflect concern for the communities and the commitment to the practices which follow only the highest standards of legal, moral, and ethical integrity. And the only way to ensure that happens is if we have an effective compliance program. And also, just like due process, because it is the right thing to do. It is also now a mandate. We didn't used to have compliance programs, but under the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, any healthcare organization that bills or pays more than $5 million annually in federal funds is required to have a, quote, effective corporate compliance program. So it's no longer a suggestion or a best practice. We have to do it. And also the stakes are very high when you think about the dollar figures involved in potential fraud, waste, and abuse that I mentioned earlier, that $3 billion in fiscal year 12.